We are now more than a week into the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. With each passing day, there are no indications of peace ensuing anytime soon. As the threat of ground invasion looms over Gaza, the Israeli military have ordered 1.1 million Gazans to evacuate the northern region. And since then, 70 people fleeing to south have been killed in Israeli airstrikes. Meanwhile, human suffering continues and the death toll continues to rise. So far, over 2,200 Palestinians have lost their lives, and at least 1,300 Israelis have also been killed in the ongoing war as the war in Israel enters day 8. In the latest, according to reports, Saudi Arabia has suspended talks with Israel on possible normalization of ties. The Gulf Kingdom never recognized Israel and also did not join the US-brokered Abraham Accords in 2020, which saw the Gulf neighbors establishing formal ties with Israel. The Israeli army apologized for the death of the Reuters journalist who was caught up in cross-border shelling along the frontier with Lebanon. And as the withering air campaign continues, Israeli army says that the strikes have killed 2 Hamas military commanders who were behind the cross-border deadly rampage in Israel a week ago. The military also said that it killed the head of the Hamas aerial system and also a company commander. In a briefing, the IDF said that the aim is very clear, which is to end state of this war by dismantling Hamas. IDF said that the situation on the northern border with Hezbollah is also very tense. According to the reports, Israeli shelling struck a Lebanese army observation post at the border, and this comes after Israeli army suspected an armed infiltration from Lebanon. New documents have surfaced that reveals that the militant group Hamas intentionally targeted elementary schools and a youth center in the Israeli kibbutz region. This was done to kill as many people as possible, seize hostages and quickly move them into the Gaza Strip. As revealed by NBC News, these documents, which are labeled as top secret, include detailed maps that show how the group planned and to surround and infiltrate these areas. On the other hand, Israeli strikes continue to pound Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces have shared footage and it shows their continued strikes on the alleged Hamas targets in Gaza. In a fresh strike, Israeli airstrikes hit the region where Palestinian rescue team were operating. And they have also released another footage which shows rockets being launched from Gaza towards Israel. New videos have also emerged showing the gruesome attacks Hamas mounted last Saturday that triggered the war. A Hamas recorded video shows militants at the site of the Nova Music Festival in Israel's Reim. Militants can be seen arriving at the site and later shooting at portable toilets. At least 260 festival goers were killed in the Hamas attack that ensued. Hamas has also released a video showing militants with captive Israeli children during the armed group's weekend cross-border rampage from the Gaza Strip. The militants can be seen bandaging the foot of an Israeli child while others carried infants. The video is suspected to be from Israel's kibbutz Holot. There was no indication as to what the status of the captive children's parents or the guardians were. Meanwhile, at the domestic front, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to face heat. The demonstrators gathered in the capital to demand answers from the government about Israeli hostages taken by Hamas. Russia, in the meantime, has proposed a draft UNSC resolution on the conflict that calls for a humanitarian ceasefire and condemns violence against civilians and all acts of terrorism. As for the reports, Russian diplomat is planning to meet Hamas next week for talks to free hostages. And speaking of international diplomatic efforts, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken continues his West Asia trip, and he is currently in Saudi Arabia, where he met with the Saudi Foreign Minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan. He was earlier in Bahrain, where he met the country's king and prime minister as well. In Qatar, he met with Qatari Emir, country's prime minister, and also the foreign minister. And speaking in Doha, Blinken said that here there can be no more business as usual with Palestinian militant group Hamas. However, Qatar's Prime Minister has signaled that Qatar would not be closing the Hamas political office.
You've been very busy. Well, all of us are busy. Yeah. Probably all of us. Thank you very much.
And for more on this, we're now being joined by Israel-Palestine. He is an associate professor of political science at the Tel Aviv University, and he's joining us live from Jerusalem. Thank you so much for joining us on WION.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening, Professor. Now, Israel has launched localized raids into Gaza as it prepares for a ground offensive. What are some of the complications that the IDF may face, keeping in mind that the Gaza Strip is one of the most densely populated areas on the earth? And how can the Israeli army achieve its main objectives of destroying Hamas, like Netanyahu has clearly expressed, while also limiting troop losses and civilian casualties at the moment?
I think the simple answer is that it cannot. In Gaza, you have beyond 2 million Palestinians. There are different estimations. It could go to as high as 2.4 million people. The Hamas have about 40,000 armed men. Many of them are hiding in the tunnels network that they have built throughout the years. It's a sort of an ongoing maze. It will be nearly impossible for the IDF to completely dismantle the Hamas all over the Gaza Strip.
Right. So, Professor, you are expecting a high number of casualties?
If there will be a grand land invasion, for sure, to both the Israeli side and to the Palestinian side. Yeah.
And we're also being joined by Principal Diplomatic Correspondent Siddhant Sibal. Hi, Siddhant. You are right now in Israel. What are you hearing? What's the on-ground situation like? Right, there seems to be some technical glitch out there. Coming back to you, Professor, like you mentioned, that it is impossible to with the casualties rising at the Gaza Strip, especially with Israel's ground offensive, with one IDF spokesperson also saying that think of the Gaza Strip as one layer for civilians and the other layer for Hamas. And my question to you is that will the IDF be able to differentiate between Hamas and the Gazans? The pertinent question here also being that are they even willing to do so?
To the latter question, definitely. I think Israel, unlike the Hamas, does not deliberately target civilians. But as to the former question, to what extent this is possible to clearly distinguish between the two, it's far, far harder. The Hamas usually hide behind human shields, civilian human shield, not always wearing uniforms. I think it will be extremely hard for the IDF to make that distinction. This is why the IDF basically ordered the Hamas, the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip up north to evacuate to the south so as to focus only on Hamas leadership and activists. But it will be extremely hard, I think, for the overall population to follow suit. And we should expect many more civilian casualties.
Right, Professor, you speak of how they will not target the civilians, the Gazans at the Gaza Strip there. But according to the latest reports, the Israeli military have ordered 1.1 million Gazans to evacuate to the northern region there. And since then, 70 people fleeing to the south of Gaza have been killed in the Israeli airstrikes. What do you have to say on that?
Yeah, I think that overall what we will see again and again are elements of collateral damage. When the IDF targets what the IDF believes are Hamas activists or Hamas infrastructure, we can expect, as we have seen over the past week, as we have seen in many rounds of fighting between Israel and Hamas, to see what is often referred to as collateral damage by civilians. That has happened before, it is happening now, most likely in a larger scale than ever before. It's unfortunate, obviously, for both sides, because on both sides, I believe the overwhelming majority would like to live, if not in peace, at least in some sort of coexistence.
We are also now being joined by Principal Diplomatic Correspondent Siddhant Sibal, who is right now in Tel Aviv. Siddhant, what is the on-ground situation like?
Well, one thing I can tell you that the WION team has been almost here on the ground for now 2 to 3 hours, and it has been a ghost city. It has been a ghost airport. When we landed at the airport, we were among the very few foreign nationals at the airport. A lot of Israelis we saw coming back to the country to, of course, support their families and, of course, support their country. But essentially, there is a sense of tension in the air and a sense of worry. Well, today is our first day, and many people who we have spoken to have warned us not to go to a southern part of the country given the situation there. But essentially, we have seen reportage from that part of the country, and it looks like as the build-up continues by the Israeli side, there is, of course, an imminent siege of Gaza expected as well. But all in all, when it comes to the anger here, there is palpable sense of anger on the street as to what happened almost a week ago. A week ago here in Israel, we saw many people being killed, and this is something that Israel is highly unlikely to forget ever, and there will be lessons learned.
Right, Siddhant, Netanyahu has vowed that Israel will win this war, and he has asked 1.1 million Gazans. He's given them rather 6-hour window to travel towards South Gaza. What are you hearing on the expected Israeli ground offensive?
Well, it looks like a matter of time that there will be a ground offensive launched by the Israeli side, and this was something that was coming. In fact, many of the reportage we have seen from the ground is that there has been a major build-up, and also the cities in the south like Zedrot and others have been evacuated as well. These cities have essentially become a ghost town. Today, of course, is Shabbat, so of course a lot of people are at their home. But essentially, there is a worry as to when the next rocket hits. Of course, we know that there is the Iron Dome, which is working, including here in Tel Aviv. But all in all, a lot of worries. But there is anger on the street, and this is something that the Prime Minister, the Israeli Prime Minister, is expected to channel in many senses by, of course, launching that ground offensive in Gaza.
Yes, Professor Uriel, coming back to you, the same question I want to ask you, that is Israel has announced a 6-hour window for Gazans fleeing south. What happens if they're not able to displace themselves in the time frame given?
That's a fine question, and I have no good answer to that. That will be a call that should be made, obviously, not just by the IDF, but by political leaders. There is a sort of a new unity, a crisis government in place. They should be making a very hard decision. Do they want to carry out the attack or to give more time, hours, maybe a day or two, for the people in Gaza to evacuate to the south? It's going to be a hard decision. I think, personally, I believe that the primary consideration should be humanitarian. We should aim to cause injury and kill as fewer as civilians as possible.
Thank you, Professor Uriel, for joining us on WION and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.
Right. Siddhant, coming back to you, is there any update on the plans to retrieve the hostages taken by Hamas?
Well, the place where I am standing, just a few minutes away from this very place, the family members of the hostages are now protesting, calling on the government to make sure that there is an early release. And this is something that we have seen in other major capitals as well, including, of course, in France and in US, where, of course, the family members of the hostages have been asking their governments to take a strong action to make sure that these hostages are released as soon as possible. But remember, today is 1 week since that terrible tragedy took place, and hopes fade almost every hour now. We know that there have been raids by the Israeli sides in Gaza, and there have been certain reports on the situation of the hostages, but unlikely in terms of how the hopes, of course, are fading and how it is translated on the ground. But all in all, when it comes to the the hostages situation, that is something that is the biggest priority in front of the Israeli government, the release of these hostages. And as the Israeli ambassador in Delhi said that when it comes to Israeli actions, he reminded that what happened in Munich, where the Israeli athletes were killed, similar action will be taken by the Israeli government if the hostages are not released.
Yes, Siddhant, the question of the release of hostages, it remains extremely paramount and critical at the moment as the war enters day 8. But also talk to us about how there's another set of demonstrations going on in Tel Aviv against the Israeli leadership on the intel failure in being able to see such a huge attack which took place last weekend.
Well, of course, that was the big question on the mind of everyone from day one. It's a major intelligence failure. But of course, the government is showing a brave face and has, of course, made a unity government as well. But remember, Netanyahu has been facing not a very bright political future. We saw a lot of protests in Israel over judicial reform. And now this development has happened. Now, Netanyahu, of course, will be making sure that there is strong action, which, of course, helps politically as well, but there is a need to accountability, and that is what the people of Israel have been asking. But as of now, the focus of the people and of the government is to make sure that war ends and there is some kind of solution, and of course the hostages are released, and after then there is and there will be time of accountability, something that the people of Israel are seeking very closely and urgently.
Yes, Siddhant. Thanks very much for joining us. That was the Principal Diplomatic Correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, joining us live from Tel Aviv. Please stay safe, Siddhant.